All right, it's official. Welcome everybody to Conversations with CAGT. I'm Dr. Colleen Ehrlich. I am the immediate past president now of CAGT. And with me, we have got Dr. Jess Manzone, and Dr. Julia Nyberg had an unfortunate family emergency, so she won't be able to join us here tonight, but we thank Jess for coming here and joining us. And so just a little bit about Jess. So Dr. Jessica Manzone is an assistant professor of practice in the College of Education at Northern Arizona University. She was a classroom teacher and instructional coach before entering higher education. Dr. Manzone currently serves as lead faculty for the Arizona Teacher Residency, where she works to prepare graduate students for future careers serving their local communities. Dr. Manzone's research interests include curriculum and instruction for diverse, gifted, and advanced students. Dr. Manzone speaks at state, national, and international conferences on gifted education and provides demonstration lessons for school districts related to curriculum and instruction. Dr. Manzone is also the co-creator of the Home and Community Connections model, which provides teachers with a means of modifying curriculum through a culturally sustaining lens. So thank you so much, Dr. Manzone, Jess, for being here this evening, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Colleen. Let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. Is that coming through correctly?
Yes, perfect.
So welcome everyone. I am happy to be here on behalf of my partner and friend, Jules Nyberg. She unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, but I will pass along any questions, comments, thoughts that we have going on. And we're here to share something that we've been working on for the last 3 or 4 years. And it is an iterative process. We are using it in classrooms all the way with preschoolers who are 4 years old up through, K-12. Julia and I are both in higher education now, working in teacher prep programs. So we're using it with our graduate students who are then taking it back to their own classrooms. So we are really interested in this being application-based and in you kind of taking ownership of this model and making it the way you want it to be. And I come here tonight wearing multiple hats. I am a former classroom teacher, and I still think of myself as a classroom teacher. Colleen said in my bio, I work with the Arizona Teacher Residency. I have 22 residents in 3 local districts in Phoenix, Arizona, where I'm in their classrooms on a regular basis. So I still am with K-8 learners. I'm an instructional coach. That's where the majority of my background lies. I'm a university professor, and I'm also a parent to a 2E child. He's the larger of the two in the like Elton John kind of get up, and his name is Dominic. And so all of the things that I construct sort of from my curriculum background, I use at home. And I know we have some parents watching, so I will also bring in that parent perspective as well. And please feel free to ask questions from a parent's point of view. So one of the things that Dr. Nyberg, that Julia and I started with, as we were both in education for 20 plus years, classroom teaching, we were thinking about what we know. And we all know this, right? Carol Ann Tomlinson's work on differentiation, Sandy Kaplan's work on differentiation, et al., right? That it can be accomplished in a lot of different ways, through a lot of different strategies, via those 4 main buckets: content, process, product, environment. And Julia and I were doing that in our classrooms, and we felt successful. But there always seemed to be something that was missing, that these were okay, and we were doing them okay. We were doing them reasonably well in whatever metric that meant, but we felt like something was missing. And when we started to ask ourselves and ask colleagues that we trusted, we realized what was missing was that we were differentiating via content, process, and product, but we weren't really doing it purposefully and with direct intent in a culturally authentic and sustainable way. That we were missing the culturally sustainable lens, that we were differentiating our tasks and our products and having these great extension menus, but it wasn't necessarily leveraging students' home and community assets. The literature would call that their funds of knowledge, their cultural wealth. And as we did a document analysis of all of the units of study and all of the wonderful lessons that we had differentiated over the years, we realized that we didn't openly identify, value, or solicit with intent. We may have done it kind of under the surface, but it wasn't a direct leverage of what students bring with them into the classroom from their homes and their communities as the means of differentiation. It may have been sort of coming along for the ride with the content, process, product, and environment, but it wasn't the major thrust. And so we thought we need to flip this paradigm, that we need to be using students' home and communities as the way to differentiate all of those other things. That it was literally flipping the paradigm by which we were going to approach our classroom instruction. But like we said, Julie and I are classroom teachers. And as we were reading the literature, Donna Ford and Tariq Grantham has published on this, Joy Lawson Davis has spoke about this, that we were looking at Delgado Burnell's Home and Community Connections, like a 2001 citation. And we're reading all of this and we're thinking, yes, this makes sense. But again, we're classroom teachers. And what do I do Monday when I go into my classroom if I want to take this and put it into practice? And so Julie and I thought about that, and we came up with a model that has been designed around a series of prompts. And it was designed with the goal that we wanted to accomplish these two things. And we're using a talent development model, and we're looking and actively searching talents that students are bringing, their interests, their identities, the diversity they're bringing from their homes and families. And we're using that as the way to uncover talents and passions and interests that they have. We're using it as a way to nurture that which they're already coming in, that the regular box that we do school doesn't necessarily provide for all these other ways that knowledge is constructed and co-constructed at home. And we also wanted it to be a way to personalize a learning experience. So in that respect, we're moving from differentiation for the whole class, small group differentiation, and now into this idea of personalization, where it's not teacher-directed differentiation, but I, the student, have these home and community assets that I bring with me. They're mine. No one can take those away from me. And I, as the student, can use them at will in any context or situation that I'm being asked in school to start to personalize what I know, to start to personalize how I show what I know to others. And that was our goal. So again, we thought about this and went, okay, shoot, how do we do this? And that's where both Julie and I went to graduate school at the University of Southern California with our mentor and teacher, Dr. Sandra Kaplan. And if you're familiar with Dr. Kaplan's work, she has the prompts of depth and complexity, and they're keywords coupled with an iconic pictorial prompt. So Julia and I thought about, how can we take all of the literature on funds of knowledge and cultural wealth and culturally sustainable instruction and put it in something that a kindergarten teacher could take back and activate for students? What would that look like? And we developed this set of prompts. And we can make this available to you, or you can screenshot it, although I'm outside my depth with how the tech works. And we have two sets of prompts. This is our set for the K3 grade levels. You'll notice the nomenclature or the language changes a little bit. Communication in the K3 prompt, as you move in the upper grades, becomes communication structure. Artistic contributions in the upper grades kind of is whittled down to become art in the K3. The prompt is the same and the essence behind it is the same, but we wanted to make it accessible across the grade levels. So when you see this slide here, this is the prompt we're using in our preschools with 4-year-olds all the way up to 2nd grade. This is the prompt we're using 3rd grade and above. We give our graduate students both sets of prompts because our graduate students are in placements across the K-12 spectrum. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to walk you through each one of these prompts. I'll give a brief definition for sake of time. I'll do 2 prompts at a time, and then we'll look at like how students are actually using them to personalize a standards-based lesson, right? And I'm intentionally saying how students are using them because that's ultimately what we want. If you think of these prompts like keys, think of like your building manager, right? The building manager that works in my office has a massive key ring, probably 25 keys on them, and each key opens the door to something different, right? One might be the elevator or the maintenance room or the laboratories, whatever it is. The prompts here are cognitive prompts for our thinking, but they activate different avenues of exploration via things that come from who we are, our identity, what we have learned and experienced from our communities and our cultures and our backgrounds. And we have those keys available. Each one of us walks around with that key ring all the time. And we can unlock whatever the teacher is asking us to do through the lens of our assets and strengths. That's the essence of the model. So our job in this model is to bring the prompts into our classroom, to start to use them with our students so that they can ultimately use them on their own. And there's no right way to do this. And this model will force you as the teacher to explore your own content through your own home and community lenses. And that's a really interesting journey. Okay, so we're going to start with language, and you can introduce these to students in any order that you want, but we had to put them in some order for the sake of a slide deck. But when you're introducing them in your classroom, you would think about who are your learners and what prompt would make the most sense for them to start with. What prompt would be interesting for them, and what content do you have to teach, and what content is lending itself maybe to a prompt or a series of prompts. So you start with 2 or 3 and build on from there. And the more you use them, the more students will internalize. Just like when you I don't cook, but just like if those of you that do, you know that like when you're first learning a new recipe, you may have to follow that recipe like exactly, and it feels a little uncomfortable. But then once you learn it, you don't even need the recipe book. Same thing here. You as the teacher bring these in to your classroom. You make them available in your lessons. You purposefully solicit this kind of information from your students. If they feel comfortable and safe to share, if not, they can pass and you model. And then they will start to use it on their own, and they won't need the prompt. They won't need the scaffold from you. So this is the prompt of language. And this prompt is really focused on the vernacular or the words that people and that our students or our children, whether you're looking at this with a parent perspective, that our students use at home. What words do we say in our house that are unique to us or unique to our background or where we're from? And this prompt could be the expressions that people use, the way that they see it. And it could be specific to my family. It could be specific to a community. Okay. And it could be something. I was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland, and people use the word hun a lot. It's not any kind of relationship other than, hey, can you pass me that ketchup, hun? And that's just what people say, and it's very normal. And when I moved from Baltimore to California, it was not so normal. No one said it. When I said it, people looked at me really strange. So it was a dialect. It was something that was unique to that community and that city that didn't necessarily translate. And one of the things we're interested in here is how many more students would be successful in school-based tasks if we valued the language and the way that they said things from home. That goes along with the next one, and we intentionally put these two together. Communication, whereas language was about the specific words that people were using, communication is about how those words are being used. It's about form and function. It's about methodology. It's about thinking about the idea that we communicate in lots of different ways. And sometimes the way that I communicate is not the way that my students communicate. I told you I have 22 graduate students. And we're looking at doing a lot of cognitive coaching with them. And the first thing I do when I sit down with them at the beginning of the school year is I say to them, how do you best like to receive feedback? Because I tend to be a pretty direct person. And, I talk with my hands, I talk fast, I like to move the conversation forward. But that's not necessarily how some of my residents best communicate. That's not their communication style. And if I haven't learned what theirs is, if they haven't learned what mine is, that we're always going to be mixing our messages, so to speak. So this one is about getting to know our students and openly asking them, how do you best like to communicate? How would you best like to receive feedback from me? On my very first year teaching, I had my students doing science journals, and I collected them and I wrote notes. I thought I was doing a good teacher thing, and I wrote notes in their science journals, and I had a student very upset that I wrote in their journal because that was his journal. So I now write on Post-it notes and I stick them in the journal so that they could take them away. That's sort of a nonverbal way that we might communicate with a student. And again, one more example, and then I'll move on. I have a student that I'm working with in the K-12 grades that has high anxiety. And so she wears a bracelet. And one of the things that she does with her teacher and I is when she needs a moment, she takes the bracelet off and she puts it on the corner of her desk. And that's her nonverbal signal to her teacher that she's just going to step away, or that she's just going to kind of tune out, even if she's still sitting there. And then when she's ready, she puts the bracelet back on. It's these types of things that how can we solicit from students how their families communicate, how their cultures communicate, how their communities communicate? How can we bring that into the classroom? Different classrooms communicate in different ways. You can expand this prompt however you want. That's the essence of it. So let's look at an example. And Julie and I have an example on the left-hand side of your screen where it's like the original task or question. This is based off of Science Standard, right? We literally copied and pasted it from the NGSS Science Standards. It's something that would, spiral across any grade levels, but it's asking students to create a model that represents the needs of different plants and animals. Okay, that was the task. That was what everybody had to do. In one of our classrooms where students are using the home and community connections model quite regularly with their teachers, one student chose, he got the choice and to address this task, to respond to it, right? I like that more than answer, to respond to this task through the prompt of communication structures. So he was going to research water conservation in his local community, which happened to be up on the Navajo reservation. And he was going to create a model for conserving water and what water meant to his community. And he was going to present that in a community gathering. And this is where we, the teacher, were not saying to him, okay, you have to present it at a school board meeting. No, that's not where their community came together. It could be a religious meeting. It could be a meeting out in the park because that's where everybody gathered. So you're really letting the student dictate, this is where I'm going to present this. This is where I'm going to present my authentic task because this is meaningful to the community. It's communicating it in a way that is representative of the learner's interests. It's representative of something that is promoting social action in the community. All of those are intended consequences of this. All right, let's keep going. The next prompt we're talking about is society, and it's the idea that society is ubiquitous, right? That it exists. It's like a fog that permeates everything. It's the world around us and the relationship that we all have with that, and that we all have adults, kids, we all have multiple groups within society that we're members of. And sometimes we engage differently. Sometimes different pieces of our identity are highlighted in different groups. Sometimes we're excluded from groups because of our identity or our perceived identity. So it's letting students see that society is all around us and that we have a relationship to it, and that relationship changes based on different variables. Then we're also talking specifically, and we're letting students specifically talk about culture, and that all students bring with them culture. All students have culture, because these are the beliefs, the rituals, the identities, the memories that exist within a family. And sometimes I'm very careful with the word family, because some students don't have a positive relationship with their family. So you can broaden that to say, who sits at your table? And what memories or identities or beliefs do you have and share with that group of people? So we're making sure that we're being inclusive and not excluding people because of their current family dynamic. And again, it's about valuing, it's about recognizing, it's about being able to share. If you're using Southern Poverty Law Center's anti-bias framework standards, and you're looking at those identity and diversity standards, it's about valuing and exploring one's own identity, recognizing that, sharing that with others, and learning about others who might have different beliefs or memories or rituals than you might have. Okay, let's look at another classroom example. So again, we took this one, or a version of this one, from the California State History Standards, and it's looking at comparing patterns of communities, but almost all social studies units do something related to community. So connect it to what you teach. That's the must do, patterns of communities. One of our students decided that she wanted to explore that by examining the cultural elements. And when we asked her what she meant by that, she said, well, in order to explore a pattern of something, a pattern is made up of a compilation or a collection of details. Oh, okay. So we can look for any details that form a pattern. And she was going to specifically look for the cultural elements in communities that formed patterns over time. And what might those elements be? They might be rituals, they might be beliefs. And she was going to look at those to then look broader at patterns in community. But she was starting with her own culture and her own community, and she was going to mirror or show the dichotomy between those things. That was her choice. She's still looking at that standard, but she's like putting on a pair of glasses that says, I'm going to look at that standard and explore that standard and that task through the lens of cultural elements. And somebody else might have a different pair of glasses on while examining that same standard in the same class, going on at the same time. Okay, let's keep going. The next prompt is related specific to history, and we're really looking at how groups of people have been treated over time, the influence and the impact of time on people's collective history. And again, we are looking at contextualizing treatment of people, a family, a community over time. Has the treatment of that group of people changed? Has it not? Why or why not? What are the variables that are affecting that? What is our responsibility when we see unethical treatment of people over time? What are we going to do about that? That we're not whitewashing anything. We're not like, I have some colleagues at Northern Arizona University that are looking specifically at indigenous erasure in current standards in Arizona. That would fall under this history prompt. And what are we going to do? What is our next steps to do that? It falls in line with looking at diverse literature and looking at whose voices have historically been marginalized, whose voices are always represented over time, and how does that impact that group of people in society? That couples nicely with the prompt of philosophy, and it's just the idea that every student, no matter how old they are, comes in with a philosophical orientation to things, whether they know it or not, because their families do. And the philosophical orientation that you bring might shape the way that you see things. Philosophy might shape perspective. And you could do this with a novel study. Let's say I'm reading a book in my class. That's the must-read text that I have to read in 5th grade. And I might look at instead of asking some of the questions that we typically ask: who is the main character and what is the conflict as a literary element in the story, all those good things. But what if I asked, what is the philosophical point of view of the main character? Find evidence in the text that support your reasoning or rationale. Oh, that's interesting because it's inferential. And I still have to do a character analysis, but now I'm looking for something that is not as overt. Maybe I'm looking at the philosophical point of view of the author as they were writing it. And what was the context in society going on while they were writing this? Was their book or philosophical point of view accepted in their time, or was it not? Those are some of the questions that you can get at here. Okay, let's look again. So we're still going back to a version of that standard on communities. How do rules help or hinder in communities? This one I think is like a second grade iteration of that standard. And we had a second grader choose to answer that prompt by looking at it through a philosophy lens. And it's very interesting. And you know, when you work with gifted kids, like, be prepared to not be the smartest person in that room, right? And that's the beautiful thing of it. You're not. And you lean into the, I don't know. That's interesting. Explain that to me. So when you have a little second grader walk up to you and go, Miss Jess, I'd like to restructure that question. Sure. How would you like to restructure it? Well, I would really like to think about rules in communities and how they're in harmony or discord. And I'm like, harmony or discord? Okay. What does harmony or discord mean? I asked the second grader, and they say, well, whether they're helpful or harmful, whether they're like positive or negative. Okay. With the philosophy of the people living in that community. Oh, that's interesting. So this second grader, I would never in a million years would I have thought to do that. Admittedly, would have never thought to do that. But this kid decided that they wanted to look specifically at the rules in their community and whether or not they were in a line with the philosophical beliefs of that community. And the incident was related to the local library. And the local library had set up, I don't know if you're aware, but there's like an architectural movement called hostile architecture. And you've seen it, I know you've seen it. And it's where they take park benches and it's not a long bench, they separate it out so that someone can't lay for extended periods of time, right? So they had just put up in front of the library a set of benches like that. And they had put up these bumps so that kids couldn't skateboard and whatever. So the student wanted to look at that rule, this rule of like hostile architecture and this rule of like, where are people allowed to be in a community? And is it in alignment with what we as a community want to believe? Very interesting. As a consequence of, they actually went to different libraries in the community to look to see if that was a pattern across the community. They went to neighboring communities to look, and they wrote a petition to see if they could get it removed. It wasn't removed, but it didn't matter. They were trying, which couples beautifully into this next prompt. And this next prompt, as you can see through my example, was dovetailed into that work. This prompt is looking specifically at action. And it's looking at the idea that we have students in our classrooms that are very civic-minded, that idea of civic actionary, of wanting to make change in one's community. They're doing that. They've been to every march. They're the ones putting up signs in their local community to raise awareness for a specific issue. And yet the tasks that we ask them to do in school don't necessarily openly solicit that or value that. And some of the current work that Dr. Nyberg and I are working on is this idea of critically conscious talent development. What does that look like? That we have learners in our classrooms that are very critically aware. They can recognize systems of oppression in the world and in the context of their content, and they're working to openly address that and challenge it. It's a sign of giftedness. Joe Renzulli, Bob Sternberg are calling it wisdom-based, ethically minded, gifted learners. And Julie and I are looking at what does that mean in terms of talent development. And we can start building this into our curriculum through this prompt. You can dovetail this into authentic products or authentic assessments where students are working in their communities to solve problems. That might be a service learning component or something like that. This prompt can also be done on a more micro level, where we had an example where a student in the class, her sister was diagnosed with cancer. So now you have an 8-year-old in a class where their younger sibling is diagnosed with cancer. And the class felt this collective sense of empathy and compassion. And they wanted to make meals for this family. And what can we do? And how can we make sure that there's a rotating list of people that call and check in? And the class took this on. That's action. And how are we valuing that? And openly asking for it in our lessons. The next prompt, and I promise I will be on my soapbox for like 2 seconds and then I'll get off. This prompt we really see as an equity issue here, that there are some schools that we work with that are in higher wealth areas that have arts programs, or that can have a parent fundraiser and raise money for an artist, and they have an arts program and other schools do not. And think about kids whose reason for being, whose reason in their soul is in the arts, music, dance, theater, visual, and performing. And there's nothing for them. There's nowhere in school, there's nowhere in the content they're being asked to learn, or the tasks or questions that they're being asked to respond to. Do they ever get a chance to see the arts and to share that talent or that interest? So that's why this prompt has been specifically designed for that reason. It's also been designed to show that communities, all cultures have artists and artisans that are doing the work in their community that highlight the rituals and the culture and who those people are and who that culture is. If you've ever been to downtown Phoenix is nationally known for its street art, for its murals. When COVID first started, murals went up and they were being done by local artists in their local communities. Kids were like, oh yeah, my dad painted that part of that mural. Yeah, my uncles and I helped design that piece of it. And so they were really trying to rally love and compassion and hope in their own communities. And that's what we're looking for here. Oh, and I also want to highlight here, Julia is the artist with an arts credential. So I don't want to be remiss in saying this. We're looking at non-traditional forms of art. We're not just looking at art, please. We're not just looking at art that hangs in museums, because the art that hangs in museums are typically done by white, European, Christian, straight men. And we're not looking for that perspective always. We're looking for other art that's done in different medium, that's done that's done in the basket weaving, or that's done in the quilting that artists are doing, that's done by collecting little pieces of sand or sand-blown glass and putting it together. It doesn't matter, but we're not just looking for formal art done by recognized artists. Okay, go back to that same standard. We're revisiting them with a purpose. Communities, comparing patterns of communities around the world. So in the same class where you heard the first example was the student we talked about previously. This student, same classmate, was going to look for patterns where her classmate looked for patterns in terms of cultural elements. This student is looking for patterns through the artistic contributions. So again, look at all the different details that we can use to form or shape patterns. And they wanted to start with the art. So they wanted to start with different communities in different parts of the United States have different art forms, because different people live there and they're highlighting the resources available in that area. And that's what this student started with. This student also happened to be an artist herself and was creating some of her own work to highlight some of those patterns. So it's a great way to meet some of those art production standards and art as interpretive standards. I know, this one is a This one is a hot one, right? I live in Arizona. I know this is a hot one. So we're not talking about you, the teacher, sharing your political point of view. It's meant to be a reminder and a reference for all of us, students and teachers, that we all step into any situation with a political affiliation, whether we make it known or not, whether we're openly saying it or not, right? We teach our values, it seeps out whether we want to or not. And that our students and their families are coming to school board meetings with political affiliations. They're coming to parent-teacher conferences with orientations. Some may be in line with us, some may differ. Again, it's not meant to challenge or change anyone's beliefs or to put anyone's beliefs down. All it's saying is we are recognizing that political orientation kids are walking in with, even if they can't articulate it, and it influences other things that go on. It influences the way that they read that novel. I have a high school teacher friend who was teaching The Crucible down in the South Bay, honors English, 10th grade. And kids are coming in with different political affiliations. So as he's teaching The Crucible, he's looking at the juxtaposition between political perspective and themes of witchcraft in the text and examining that through conflict as a literary element. He's not putting anyone on blast. He's simply saying these things are connected. That's what this prompt is asking. Then we're looking at the idea of traditions, and traditions are things that are passed down. They can be actual tangible objects that someone has given someone else, or they can be intangible memories. And it's thinking about why those things are special, and that's what makes us unique, are these special things, and that we all might not have the same tradition, but we might have a version of that tradition. One of my students is Navajo, Dane, and we went up on the Navajo land, and I had fry bread for the very first time. And she was talking about the tradition of how her family and her tribe makes fry bread. And I've never made fry bread. I had never had it before back in Baltimore. We didn't have that. But I have challah in my culture. It's Jewish bread. And I was able to share that with her. She tried that for the first time. She was teaching me how to make that. I was showing her how it's braided and what that meant. And it turns out both are round. Oh, and why? Symbolizing life and completeness and a circle and harmony. And yet two very different traditions, two very different cultures, but commonalities. It's just a chance to see students. Teaching is a human profession, as you know, and we need to, in order to differentiate, to truly differentiate, we need to see each other as people. We need to see who we are, and the model, we hope, gives teachers and students a chance to say, this is me in this space, see me, I am here. Okay, so hang with me on this one. So this is a science standard talking about forecasting weather and responding to severe weather. So this student decided to use two prompts. Miss, can I use two? Yes, absolutely. How are you coupling them? What made you choose those two in tandem? Okay, they wanted to look at traditions over time and social action. And this is where do the teacher thing, where when they say, oh, I'd love to use this, instead of the knee-jerk reaction of, oh my gosh, I'm not sure that's going to work. How in the world are you going to do that? Just go, why? Oh, that's interesting. How are you going to do that? What supports do you need from me in order to do that? Explain that to me. That sounds really interesting. So they wanted to, oh, am I at time? Oh, no.
You're good. You're good. We just have 2 questions, so keep going.
Okay. Time management is my Achilles heel. And I'm like, oh, shoot, I'll be quick. So they wanted to think about, and they wanted to kind of interview local community members and how they have forecasted weather traditionally over time, how that has been done through oral stories and how those oral stories have been passed down. And they were thinking about how their ancestors forecasted weather. And Julia tells a beautiful story about how her mother, Julia Nyberg's mother, was raised in Canada up by the Arctic Circle, and how her family's ancestry forecasted weather is very different than some of the conversations that Julia has living in Southern California with her son. And thinking about how these communities have used those forms of communication and those traditions to address some social action. Again, as I was talking to some of my residents who are members of different tribes in Arizona, they were telling me this really fascinating story, how at the start of COVID, the tribes were using their oral stories and they were building in mask wearing as part of their oral stories as a way to promote wearing your mask during the pandemic. Okay, last one. This prompt is really based on the idea that every student and family is a problem solver. And we're really looking at the idea that kids come in already problem solvers and thinkers and validating that. And we know that many of you are using a CGI approach to math, or that you're fostering intentional talk in a math class that's letting students bring their strategies and how would you solve this? And now let's sort of juxtapose both of our strategies. That's what we're going for here, is that we all solve problems all day, every day. And how are we validating the problems that students are solving in their communities? How are we validating the solutions and the strategies that students are bringing into their classroom? So those are the prompts. Colleen, let me just put up my contact and then I'll stop sharing and we can talk about any questions. These are our contact information. We're happy to send you more information on the prompts. Like I said, Julie and I have been using them in classrooms for almost 4 years now, and we've been tweaking them and thinking about other ways to define them. And if you have suggestions on how to do that, we are all ears. If you want to start using them in your classroom, Jess, how can I get the ball rolling with this? Email me, call me. We're happy to chat with you and just play around with this. And the only thing it requires is an openness to go, I'm going to learn about myself in this process, and I'm going to intentionally learn about who my students are as people in this process.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jess. I think ultimately anything that helps bring who the student really is into the classroom is a value add. And so I appreciate that piece. We have got 2 questions, one from a teacher perspective, one from a parent perspective.
Oh, great.
So the first one is from the teacher perspective. I know we had kind of talked about the question you get quite a bit is like, how do I start this? And I think this question has a little bit of a different spin on this, is like, how do I start this as a teacher if either my building administrator and or my district isn't there?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a great question, and one that quite frankly, and I know I'm live on Facebook saying this, one that quite frankly, like, I'm in Arizona, right? So think about what you know about the context of that in the news. It's a great question, and it's one that I am personally trying to wrestle with and reconcile now. One of the things that we can connect it to is like transformative social emotional learning, right? Like if our buildings are doing that, then link it to that, because when we give students a chance to talk about who they are and build empathy and compassion and think about the ways in which we communicate and interact in those personal communications with others, that is what this model is doing. So I would say lean into what your building is already doing. Lean into what your building values and your admin values, and then show how this is in service of that. Because it's really not something extra, like my building values this. My building does an SEL block every morning. Beautiful. I'm going to do this in my SEL block, and look at that. Mm-hmm. Like, it's finding a way to say, this is not an extra add-on. This is a way to funnel everything else that we can do. It's a way to learn about who our students are. I can't think of any building that I haven't worked in over the last 20 years where the first week of school, we do getting to know you projects and like, right, whatever. So like, how we can just do it through this lens. What if we got to know our students through a piece of art from their culture?
Yeah, I think that's brilliant, right? So connect it to something that's already there, find an inroad, and then keep following that.
Right.
Absolutely. And then the next question is from that parent perspective is like, so knowing this and knowing that these are elements to bring the student's identity and life into the classroom, then what would be your advice to the parents to how might they leverage this to support their child in the classroom?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. And if you're able as a parent to volunteer in the classroom and to say like, I can come in and I'm happy to come in and share this aspect of who my family is. And like, if you need like whatever novel that we're reading, if you want me to come in and I can parallel read it with a novel from our home and our community, and and I'm happy to do that with learners. We've seen a lot more parents wanting to come in when it's a more welcome space to come, right? Like share what you bring. We want to know, we want like what you bring is beautiful and complements and extends that which we're learning. We have parents that are phenomenal artists. We had the street artists that I was talking about. They came in to the classroom and they were showing students how to make murals and like what the purpose of murals was for political statements or for social activism. And the kids were drawing them, and the artists who were fathers and uncles and grandparents of our students were helping. And they felt that, and we heard from one of them say like, they had never felt welcome in their kids' school before. They'd never been asked, right? They never felt like they had anything to share. They never felt like, oh, I was never really great at school, so I don't, but like we're openly soliciting those gifts and talents.
And some of the parents have never participated in the American school system, right? So I'm not from this country originally, right? So my early education is not from the American school system either, although yet it sort of was, because I went to a similar school, but even then there's lots of learning. And even from being within the system, it's interesting how much you sometimes don't know. Right. When you're work at a different level, when you just like don't know where the bounds are, when like you don't understand even the culture and climate of like an individual school. So yeah, very, very good advice. Well, with that, we would just like to thank you so much, Dr. Manzone, for coming here and sharing your expertise and knowledge with us. And I am going to go ahead and take us off of Facebook, but thank you so much for everybody who joined us. We hope that you learned a lot. And like she said, please reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.